They laughed when my father couldn't read their safety report. They fired him for being unqualified. 27 years of silent service, erased in a minute. But while they erased his name from the payroll, I carved it into the company's foundation. Years later, they walked into the same boardroom and found him sitting at the head of the table as their CEO. I didn't raise my voice. I raised his seat. And now the same people who once mocked him stand when he enters the room. I was 17 when I saw my father come home without his name. That's what it felt like. Not like he'd been fired, not like he'd lost a job, but like someone had erased his existence with one casual signature. My father, Henry Miller, was a janitor at Wexford Engineering Solutions. 27 years of service. Never late, never loud. The kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and still apologized for things he didn't cause. He didn't build buildings, he built trust, and they still threw him away like scrap. It started on a Thursday. I remember because Thursday was his extra shift day. He called it that, my extra shift day. Like it was something he volunteered for. The company had a new VP, some hotshot named Charles Brenner, who came in swinging, rewriting policies, adding buzzwords, talking about efficiency. The kind of man who shakes your hand without looking you in the eye. They held a mandatory safety seminar, company-wide. Everyone was called to the warehouse floor. Charles was there with a mic, clipboard in hand, trying to impress a bunch of regional directors with his leadership tone. That's when he pointed to my dad. "Mr. Miller, you've been here longer than anyone, haven't you?" My father stood, humbly, nodded, wiped his hands on his overalls. "Yes, sir, 27 years. "Great. Why don't you read this aloud for the team?" Charles handed him a printed emergency protocol sheet filled with dense technical jargon. I wasn't there, but I heard the story a dozen ways. Some said my father froze. Others said he smiled nervously and said, "I'm not so good at reading, sir." That's when Charles laughed, loudly. "Can't read after 27 years? Maybe that's the problem with this place." The room fell silent. Then people chuckled. Later that week, HR called my dad in. No severance, no apology. Just a one-page document. Termination reason. Failure to meet communication standards under revised safety compliance. They made him sign it with his thumbprint. That evening he came home an hour early, didn't speak much, placed his Wexford badge on the kitchen counter like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I looked at him. "They fired you?" He nodded once, eyes still on the floor. Said it's for safety, said it's policy now. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm too old for all this. He didn't cry, but something inside him went silent, and that silence filled the whole house. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and made a promise I wouldn't speak out loud for years. One day, I'll buy the place that broke you. I'll put your name on the front door and make them say it when they clock in. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but that was the night I stopped being a boy and started becoming the man who would rewrite our story. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with ownership. The day after they fired my father, I walked him to the bus stop like usual. He didn't take the bus that day, but he still waited. Same corner, same timing. Routine is how some men stay sane. I stood beside him in silence. He didn't say much, just kept adjusting his old watch like it still mattered. "You going to school?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied. I didn't go. I sat on a bench outside the library for hours, staring at the revolving glass door of a future that felt impossibly far away. Then I opened my laptop and typed the first words of my plan. Own the place. I finished high school, but with no college funds, I had to make choices. Days were for work, warehouse jobs, inventory tracking, courier services. Nights were for learning, finance, corporate law, startup equity models. I devoured anything that taught me how businesses moved, merged, collapsed, and were reborn. While most of my classmates posted selfies with lattes and MacBooks, I studied cap tables and founder exit clauses. My friends called it obsessive. I called it preparation. At 22, I joined a venture capital firm as an intern. I didn't tell them my background. I just outworked everyone. First in, last out. No complaints. I learned how to own things silently, how to build structures with no fingerprints. I didn't want to be known. I wanted to be untraceable, until the day it mattered. Meanwhile, Wexford Engineering kept growing. and bleeding. New management, new scandals, a failed overseas expansion. Their stock slipped quietly over 3 years. When it dropped below $7, I moved. I launched Argon Equity Partners, a Delaware shell firm funded by pooled private capital. We began buying, not just Wexford. We picked up scraps of broken companies, swallowed vendor firms, acquired legal control of 2 of Wexford's suppliers. I never used my real name. All papers led back to holding companies, and all meetings were done by reps. To Wexford, we were just a faceless rescue fund offering stability. To me, it was personal. By the time I turned 31, I owned 51% of Wexford Engineering, and no one knew the son of the janitor they once humiliated was now their shadow majority owner. One winter morning, I walked into the building. The receptionist greeted me like I was just another investor. I stepped into the elevator, looked at the polished brass panel. I remembered my dad once told me, "I've cleaned this elevator so many times, it knows me better than my supervisor does." I ran my hand along the wall. "Don't worry, Dad. It'll know you again, this time from the top." The board at Wexford gathered for what they thought was a quarterly shareholder meeting. 6 men in suits, none of whom had ever set foot in the break room. The CEO, Philip Crane, was already sweating. He'd bet the company's future on a contract that collapsed 2 months prior. Now, he was desperate. They expected a bailout. I gave them a mirror. I sat at the head of the table, legally, rightfully. Every vote had already been counted. Every signature filed. Crane leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, thank you for coming. We appreciate your interest in stabilizing the company." I smiled. "I'm not here to stabilize it, Philip. I'm here to correct its memory." He blinked. "Excuse me?" I opened the folder on the table and slid the documents across. As of this morning, Argon Equity has acquired the final controlling shares of Wexford Engineering. You're looking at the majority shareholder. The room froze. One of the directors, a grey-haired man named Richard, scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You have no experience running a firm this size." I nodded slowly. "True. That's why I'm not running it." I pressed a button on the intercom. "Send him in." The door opened, and there he was, Henry Miller, my father, wearing a pressed navy suit, tie slightly crooked, shoes polished until they gleamed, his hands still calloused, his eyes unsure. He stepped inside, hesitant. Crane stood, confused. "Who is this?" I rose. "This is Henry Miller, 27 years of service, fired without pension, mocked in front of peers, and starting today, your CEO." The room exploded. "You're out of your mind. This is a circus. He's not qualified." I remained calm. "We're not here to debate his qualifications. We're here to remind this company what it forgot. Leadership isn't always taught in boardrooms. Sometimes it's built on floors you never noticed." My father stood frozen. "Ethan, I don't understand." "You don't have to, Dad. You just have to sit in the seat they said you'd never be allowed near." I guided him to the chair. He sat, slowly, nervously, like it might reject him. It didn't. It never would again. The board protested. Legal threatened to walk. HR resigned the same day. I didn't blink, because I wasn't there for their comfort. I was there for his recognition. After the meeting, my father pulled me aside. "I don't belong there." "Yes, you do, because they made you feel like you didn't." He looked down at his hands. "I can't read their reports, son." I smiled. "You won't have to. I already rewrote the story." The first few days were uncomfortable, not for us, but for them. Executives avoided the boardroom. Department heads suddenly remembered how to say, "Sir." The man they once called the janitor now had a nameplate that read, "Henry Miller, Chief Executive Officer." He didn't give orders. He didn't sign off on budgets. He just sat at the head of the table, calm, observant, a monument to memory. I handled the operations as COO. He handled something more important, presence. Our first executive meeting under new leadership had only one rule. No one speaks until Mr. Miller is acknowledged by name. It was petty, it was precise, and it was justice. The HR director tried to resign quietly. I accepted with a handshake and handed her a letter. Dismissed without cause, no severance, no pension. Exactly what she once gave him. The VP who had laughed the loudest during my father's humiliation. He was demoted to regional oversight, reporting to a woman he once called just an assistant. He came to me red-faced. "This is personal." I smiled. "Good, because what you did was too." My father tried to argue with me, not out of pride, but out of discomfort. "Ethan, you don't have to fight for me anymore." "I'm not fighting anymore, Dad," I said. "I'm just showing them what happens when memory becomes power." Soon the company changed. Workers who never spoke started suggesting improvements. One janitor, Miguel, created a new cleaning protocol that saved $40,000 a year. I promoted him to facility manager. No degree, just talent. For the first time, Wexford engineering felt like it wasn't just built by hands, but finally led by someone who respected those hands. Every Friday, my father came in early. He'd sit at the window in his office, sipping tea, looking at the building he once mopped clean in silence. And every Friday before I left, I'd knock on his door, just once. "Need anything, Mr. CEO?" He'd smile, eyes soft. "Just proud of you, son." But the truth was, I was proud of him, because even after everything they took from him, he still walked through that door with humility and left it open for others. It started with a photo. Someone snapped it during one of our Friday morning check-ins. My father sitting behind his desk, mug in hand, sunlight pouring through the blinds. It was posted on our company's internal newsletter with the headline, "From Janitor to CEO, Mr. Henry Miller's Journey." We didn't plan for it to go public, but things like that, they travel. Within a week, it hit local news. By the end of the month, national outlets called it the most dignified revenge story of the decade. I was offered interviews, TED Talks, book deals. I said no, but I let them talk to my father. He sat for one interview, just one. The journalist asked, "Mr. Miller, did you ever imagine this day would come?" He looked at the camera, then down at his rough hands. "Number, I thought men like me were born to be invisible. My son made sure the world saw me, and maybe now it'll see others too." After that, job applications tripled, but not from Harvard grads or MBAs, from mechanics, from truck drivers, from single mothers, from young people who had been told, "You're not qualified." We launched the Henry Miller Initiative, a hiring program that removed degree requirements from 70% of Wexford's entry and mid-level jobs. Skills were tested, grit was measured, and potential was treated as currency. We didn't just fill roles, we rebuilt trust. The board tried to award me a leadership trophy that year. I declined it. Instead, I created a new award, the Invisible Backbone, given annually to a team member whose work lifts others, often unseen. The first recipient, a cafeteria worker named Clarence, who used to bring my father a free sandwich every Thursday for years. That day, I stood on the same stage where Crane once lectured about efficiency, and I said this: my father couldn't read company policy, but he knew how to listen, how to serve, how to lead with humility. They fired him for what he lacked. I hired him for what he never lost. The room stood in silence, not awkward, honored, not for me, for him. The world finally knew his name, but more importantly, he knew it mattered. My father passed away on a Sunday morning, peacefully, quietly, just like the way he lived most of his life. The nurse told me he was smiling when he went, said he whispered something like, "It's all clean now." I knew what he meant. We held the funeral in a small chapel not far from the old Wexford plant. Employees filled the pews, drivers, welders, admin staff, janitors in crisp black suits, and in the very front row, the current executive board, not invited, but they came anyway. They didn't speak, just listened to a man they once dismissed, now being remembered as a giant. The following week, I returned to Wexford alone. The building felt heavier without him, quieter, but never hollow. I walked into his old office. It still smelled like tea and old paper. On the desk sat his nameplate, polished clean. Henry Miller, Chief Executive Officer. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurting, but because there was something deeper than grief in me now. Gratitude. A month later, we unveiled a new entrance to the company. Gone were the glass doors with etched logos. In their place stood a wall of engraved names, Not of investors or founders or board members, but of janitors, mechanics, drivers, cleaners, people who had built Wexford long before the suits ever arrived. At the top of the wall, Henry Miller Hall, built by hands, remembered with honour. They once fired him because he couldn't read their reports. Now his story is required reading for every new hire. People ask me if I feel like I got revenge. I don't answer that anymore, because this was never about revenge. It was about recognition, about restoring something that should have never been taken. If you're reading this, if someone once told you that you don't belong in a room, or that you're not enough for a title or a role or a seat, let this story remind you, your worth doesn't expire just because someone else failed to see it. And if they lock the doors, don't break them. Buy the building and put your father's name on the front.